Welcome to Keller Williams. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your day today to join us. So this is part one of a four-part series that Angela and I created. Angela created, really. Just if you're not, my name is Sarah Harrington. I'm here at Keller Williams as well. I'm a real estate agent. I'm also a landlord. And I'm also in a BNI, which is a business networking organization. And that's how Angela and I know each other as well as Nick. And you know, quick background on this. So Angela and I decided to create this series because as Angela was talking about the new marijuana law that was coming into effect in Vermont, we realized as she was talking to our chapter every week about the various ways this might affect landlords and agents and attorneys and everybody and tenants for that matter, that it made sense to really compile all this information and be able to put it out to a larger group of people who would benefit from knowing this information. So that's kind of how it started. And it was going to be one class, and then we were like, let's do a series. And so Angela came up with some really great topics to be talking about, and she'll be talking about that a little bit more. So I want to give a little bit of background about Angela, because she'll be humble about herself, maybe, I don't know. Sometimes. And so Angela Zykowski oversees day-to-day operations at Vermont Landlords Association. She serves on legislative study committees and participates in the legislative process through drafting potential legislation and testifying in legislative committees on issues impacting commercial and residential landlords. She is proud to be an advocate for the landlord community, and she began this work with the Landlords Association in September of 2003, and she's now the principal member of the association. She's a frequent presenter of landlord, tenant law, and best management practices seminars for both attorneys as continuing legal education and private landlords, property managers. She's originally from Oregon and teaches and received her, I wanted to say BS degree, but I'm going to say Bachelor of Science because I giggled when I said that. Her Bachelor of Science degree in biology, so go figure the connection, from the University of Portland in Portland, Oregon. And after college, she moved to the Northeast to attend Vermont Law School, where she received her JD degree in 2003. And while in college, she worked at the Center for Endangered Pets. I wasn't expecting to read that.
Well, you know, that's a whole other seminar.
Okay, now known as the Great Cats World Park. She currently lives in Moncton, the woods of Moncton, with her family. In her spare time, she enjoys renovating her house, making maple syrup. She enjoys hiking, snowshoeing, gardening, and knitting. She, and I added this to her bio, is the owner of Must Love Yarn on Shelburne Road. So that's Angela, and I'm going to have her start in a second. And just a couple little housekeeping items. This class is 1 hour, so we might actually go a couple minutes over if people have time. Please turn off your cell phones or vibrate. If people need to use bathrooms, you can exit either side of the doors. The bathrooms are right on the other side of this wall. And I'd like to take just a second to thank our sponsor, Movement Mortgage. Michael and Guasco's here from Movement Mortgage, who has supplied us with snacks and water, so feel free to grab some snacks while you're sitting here if you get hungry. And without further ado, Angela Zykowski.
Thank you. I was just, Sarah was reading the quotes over on the wall, and I'm sorry, I was getting distracted with the don't listen to your drunk monkey. And I'm sure there's a story behind that, and it kind of fits in with this presentation today. So I have sort of tongue-in-cheek named this the 411 on 420. So, I actually had to translate this title for my husband last night. He was like, so you're going to do this presentation, what's it on? And I told him, and he's like, I don't even know what that means. So the 411, bunch of information, you know, tech speak, kids talk, on 420. So for those of you who aren't familiar, 420 is the police code for marijuana. So we're going to be talking about marijuana today, and I hope no law enforcement is actually looking at my search history, because there's probably some fun things I can find on there right now. It's research. So how did it start? Act 65 is the legislation that was passed this last year. And basically what that did was penalties for possession of limited amounts of marijuana for adults. So we're talking people over 21. Still is not it's similar to alcohol, right? So if you're under 21, same rules apply. The one thing that it did not do, it did not legalize the sale of marijuana. So technically you can't legally buy marijuana. People can give it to you, and there have been some creative entrepreneurs entrepreneurs out there in the last couple of months, and the Attorney General's office has kind of been dealing with those folks and saying no. Like pure gift, yes, you can't charge $50 for a t-shirt and it comes with a side of marijuana, which is what some folks were doing. So we're going to be kind of feeling our way through some of this as these issues come up. The other thing the legislation did was change the penalty structure for possession in excess of whatever the allowable amounts are. So if somebody has more marijuana that's allowed, it's not going to look like you're going to criminal court, going to jail. It's a series of fines, and that's probably less important for today's seminar, but it was just one of the things that went into the legislation. So some background, allowable amounts in case you're interested. You can now legally possess up to 1 ounce of marijuana or 5 grams of hashish. So both of those are allowed. You're allowed to have no more than 2 mature plants, right? So this statute also allows for cultivation. And this can be a big issue for landlords. Or no more than 4 immature plants. So I don't know if that tells me that there's a high die-off rate from immature to mature, or what happens if all 4 of your immature plants become mature plants. These are all questions that I don't know the answer to, but I'm sure we'll find out at some point. This last one is one that I raise from the cultivation standpoint. So none of these limits apply if someone is cultivating, harvesting, and storing the marijuana in accordance with the statute. So if I have 2 mature plants and I harvest it, and then I grow 2 more mature plants and I harvest it, and I'm storing that that's allowed under the act, I could have a lot more marijuana than the 1 ounce that's allowed. So this can create some issues if you're allowing cultivation on your property, besides sort of the just standard issues that we're going to get into. So what does this mean for landlords? I think there was a lot of tenants that thought this was where this is going, right? No. Sorry, guys. I hate to break the news to you. I had to break the news to a reporter at the Barton Chronicle a month or so ago that yes, landlords can prohibit this on their property. So the statute's very explicit. Landlords have the right to prohibit possession and use on their property. Done. No. Thank you for coming. No. But it's got to be in your lease. So if you don't have a written lease, now's the time to get one. If you have an old written lease, now's the time to perhaps consider revising that lease. If you have an existing lease, we're recommending doing an addendum update to it. Though I will say if you already have a no smoking clause in your lease, at least smoking marijuana should be covered under that for right now until you can get additional paperwork in place. So what happens if you get some lip from a tenant? Well, I'm not signing that. Well, then I think you need to find a new place to live. Right? I mean, that's your tool as a landlord. If somebody's going to take that sort of attitude with you, I should probably say now, if anyone has any questions, please jump in, raise your hand. If it's something we're going to cover later, I will tell you. But if you think of something before it goes out, because that's what always happens to me, please feel free to ask questions. Yes.
Will you address medical use?
We will. Okay. Yes, because that's a big, big question.
Can you evict a tenant if you find out they're in violation of what you've written into your lease?
Absolutely.
You can evict.
Absolutely.
In a timely fashion or 6
Well,
months?
timely's that's a whole nother seminar.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, I've successfully evicted tenants out of project-based Section 8. So project-based, they get evicted, they don't have any more subsidy for smoking violations. So I am fully anticipating that the courts are going to uphold lease clauses that say you can't do this. The trick with something like this is being able to prove that the tenant is engaging in the behavior that you say that they are.
So if this was not written into the lease previously and then there's an addendum, what happens if the tenant is already cultivating at that time and you supply them with the addendum?
Yeah.
What's the timeline as far as when they need to effectively comply?
So I mean, I argue 60 days, right? It's gonna, well, unless you're in Burlington, then you're probably at 90 days. So it's gonna track a rent increase. So anytime you're changing terms of the lease, we look to that window because that's what we have been given by the legislature.
Okay.
So it's specific for rent, but we've seen it used in other
Can
contexts.
you change the lease unilaterally like that? Halfway?
I would argue for something like this, which is a statute change, which people did not know until kind of the last minute that it was coming down the pipeline. I think that you're within your rights to change because this is a statute change that's happened, and you can't predict this. This wasn't just like, oh, I wasn't dealing with my paperwork. And if you have a tenant who's giving you a really big attitude about it, and that's clearly the lifestyle they want to continue on, and you don't agree with it, I mean, they're going to need to go at the end of that lease term, it sounds like, right? So some of this is about cultivating relationships with your tenants and making sure that that line of communication and expectations are understood among all the parties. Now, a lot of times that relationship will break down, and so that's like seminar 2 and 3 and perhaps 4. But I think there has to be a little bit of understanding on all sides of working through this, and we see this anytime there's a big change. This is a huge change. I know that it's been done in other states, but it's still a huge change for here. And so if sometimes I'm like, well, I don't know, we'll have to see how it plays out in the courts, because we might. But I think, having a strongly drafted lease is a first step for dealing with any issues.
So that is an interesting thought. Like, so you present the person with the addenda to the lease that says, well, now we have this new statute, you can't do this. And they say, well, I don't want to sign it. You're changing the terms of my lease. I didn't have to agree to that before.
Yep.
You think you might have to wait till the end of the lease and then say, I'm sorry, we won't be renewing. Or
That's-
could you force
that's
the issue
option.
at that juncture?
That's the safest option, right? I know you'll win on that one. And a lot of times this is the calculation we're making. What are the chances of success if you go to court on this issue now, and is it a problem? If you have a no smoking clause in your lease, that is going to take care of the smoking of the marijuana, which is going to be one of the biggest issues neighbor to neighbor, right? Because it's going to disturb other folks in the building potentially. Some of the other ways you can ingest marijuana, maybe not so much, but that one's definitely the big one. Cultivation's another big one. From what I've been told, mature marijuana plants smell stronger than actual smoking of the actual marijuana itself. So that could be a real big impact for other people in the building. But there is an argument that after you present a change like that to the tenant, that it goes into effect 60 days down the road, whether they agree to it or not.
So would a documentation, if you had a tenant that refused to sign this change, okay, would documentation protect you from something with the federal government?
Potentially, right?
Because
That's
we had to take, brokers had to take a course about marijuana, the
Yep.
real estate license,
yep.
and they were talking, and they gave examples in Colorado and California where landlords had lost their buildings because of
Yep.
occupants that were
Yep.
cultivating marijuana.
Yep. And we will cover some of that, because that's also a consideration here when you're deciding what maybe you want to allow in your buildings or advise people they should be allowing in their buildings. Still a federally controlled substance. It is still against federal law to have any amount of marijuana. Federal government does not even recognize the medicinal use of marijuana. Now, do I think the federal government is going to come in and do a forfeiture proceedings on your building if you allow your tenants to smoke some pot? Probably not. I know of one forfeiture action that was started here in the state of Vermont by the federal government. It was in Rutland County. It was a known drug house. Like, we're talking hardcore drugs, heroin, cocaine, like crack cocaine, that sort of stuff. The owner of the property was out of state. His on-site manager was a part of the drug ring that was running drugs out of the building. Any attempts to contact the landlord by the federal government to have him take action were basically ignored. And so the federal government was like, we've had it. We're going to come in and do forfeiture proceedings on this. So we see it in very extreme cases. Now, it's not to say that, you know, you allow a giant grow operation to be going on in one of your buildings that it's not going to get somebody's interest. We don't know. This is one of these gray areas that we're navigating with this conflict between the state and federal law. And the federal law does trump. So that's something to keep in mind. Federal government treats marijuana like cocaine or heroin. In their eyes, it's no different. All right, so what about cultivation? Cultivation's treated a little bit differently in this new statute. The cultivation section of the statute automatically prohibits cultivation unless the person cultivating has the permission of the person who owns the property. So there's an affirmative obligation of the tenant to seek out your permission as the landlord before they're legally able to cultivate in the property. Does that mean I think you should ignore it in your lease? No. But the statute does provide you some protections. So right now, none of your tenants have the ability to cultivate unless they've gotten your express permission to do so. So that deals with some of these lease issues, at least on the cultivation end. So what are some of the challenges for cultivation and why is this such a big deal for landlords? Well, we've already talked about the smell. It's a very stinky plant.
My first thought would be the high-powered lights, the fire hazard.
The high electrical use. Marijuana requires some pretty beefy grow lights to be able to grow. And in fact, that's how previously state law enforcement and federal law enforcement were able to figure out where some of these operations were, because the electric companies would report spikes in electrical usage, like significant spikes. It's a pretty beefy operation. These are also a very high water use plant and require high humidity. So what happens when you have a lot of water and a lot of humidity in a small space? Yeah. And guess who gets to be cleaning that up? Do you guys think you have insurance coverage if you got a grow operation going in a building and you
That
get
was
mold?
actually one of my questions. I wanted to know, are we covered?
That I don't know. That's a question for an insurance
A
agent.
lot of it covers mold, but
Yep.
I don't know if they consider the proximate cause of mold.
Right. I think there's also some insurance considerations here.
Yes.
If you're allowing use, cultivation, possession on your property, do you have insurance coverage if something happens? I mean, you know, your tenants, you know, we always joke, like, really, what's the worst thing that can happen? Your tenants are going to be raiding each other's refrigerators looking for Cheetos, but, you know, really, somebody falls down the stairs, or somebody falls off of a balcony, or falls out a window, or you name it. Something happens and someone gets hurt. Are you going to have coverage for that if you are allowing this to go on? That's something I don't know the answer to. I don't know what the insurance industry's response is to this. We should get Adam in here for a follow-up seminar. Put him on the hot seat.
Yeah, that'd be a great idea.
Yeah. Security issues? One of the things that's become very apparent in the states that have allowed commercial grow operations and the sale of marijuana is it is 100% cash business. You cannot deposit marijuana money into an FDIC insured bank. They will not take it because they are regulated federally. So you have a huge security issue. Now, we haven't legalized sale in the state of Vermont yet, but it's still a security issue, right? You have tenants growing, you have tenants that have this, other tenants know about it, or other people know about it, breaking into the property, breaking into the space, like you could have some security issues. This is what a grow operation can look like. This was a picture from Colorado. This was an illegal grow operation in a basement. I'd say probably most of you would not want this. I mean, we've got like, we've got interesting electrical. You can see the fans. You can't really, these are tubs of water down here, like those giant livestock style tubs just filled with water. Electrical, we got some interesting ductwork stuff going on there. I mean, this is like a fire, mold waiting to happen. Smelly. I mean, the police officer guy has a respirator on. Maybe he doesn't want to contact high, but I think it's probably because it just is very overwhelming when you go into a situation like this. So that's, and I've seen a few of these in Vermont. Not that were legally set up, but they destroy whatever space they're in.
I sold one that was, the guy had a place in Heinsberg and he had cameras on the house in Milton.
Mm-hmm.
And then his electric bill was so high that they caught him from the cameras for his house in Heinsberg. And the house was all like this.
Yep. Yep. And I mean, in terms of smell, so there was a house about 3 doors down from where I live that got busted for basically being a grow operation. That somebody was renting it. They just rented the house. They didn't actually live there.
Yeah.
They rented the house and they were growing pot in the house. And the reason why it got caught was a police officer was doing some sort of welfare check or was looking for somebody and pulled up the driveway, got out of his car, and could smell the marijuana from the driveway, which then gave him probable cause to be able to go inside into this grow operation. So the smell is huge. If all this other stuff wasn't gonna bother you. So do you allow possession and use in your properties or not? Well, maybe have happy tenants if you allow it. Really mellow. You might have personal feelings or beliefs about this. I mean, this is people are very passionate about this topic. There are non-smoking avenues, right? There's ways for people to use marijuana that don't involve smoking. Oil, edibles, probably other forms that I have no idea about. We need some other people in here to educate us on that if we're really interested. But there's a whole lot of other ways to partake that maybe won't disturb the neighbors, right? Because if you're talking about a multi-unit, you're really talking about other tenants' qualities of life, right? And not being disturbed by one tenant. Or not. Still a federal violation. So you kind of have that still hanging out there over you if you're a landlord. The thing to keep in mind, if you rent to Section 8 tenants, you absolutely cannot allow it, particularly in those units. It's a no-no. And in fact, I have 2 versions of lease language. One that I'm recommending for your general non-Section 8 tenants, and one that's definitely for Section 8 tenants because one little word has changed. It's a may to a shall, because the housing authority does not take kindly to this type of behavior. It's part of that federal no drugs of any kind. Neighbor complaints about smoke. I think we're going to see this very similar to cigarette smoking, right? Lots of properties have gone to no smoking because you have less neighbor to neighbor disputes until it gets cold and they always smoke outside and now they're hanging out their bathroom window or not because it's too cold to go outside. We're going to see some of the same challenges, I think, with the marijuana. I've been told by certain advocates that secondhand marijuana smoke is actually worse for you than secondhand cigarette smoke. I don't have anything else to back that up with, and I sort of take it with a grain of salt and whose lens this is coming through, I don't know. But I would say any kind of secondhand smoke is not good for you, period. And there are other impacts that secondhand marijuana smoke can have that perhaps, immediate effects, that perhaps secondhand cigarette smoke does not have. And I also understand that it's particularly harmful to young children, the secondhand smoke.
I just want to go back for 1 second for the non-smoking avenues. If you want to make sure that there's not a trace, what kind of language do you use? And what happens if someone was given some and decides to make brownies?
Yep.
They haven't sold it, they haven't grown it, they haven't
Yep.
cultivated it.
Yep.
How do you prevent that kind of stuff?
I think you have a lease clause that says that they can't do it. But ultimately being able to prove that somebody's made pot brownies in their kitchen and consumed them, unless they're causing some sort of disturbance or there's some sort of issue where law enforcement comes or EMTs come, you're not going to know about it. So it's not that it's not enforceable, it's just your ability to know that it's happening there is very reduced.
But if outside of your knowledge, someone bakes some brownies, somebody gets hurt on your property.
If you have language in that says that you can't do it, that's an evictable offense.
So what are the words? I mean, how do
We're
you
getting
cover
there.
your base?
We're
Okay.
getting there.
Okay.
Oh, don't worry.
Okay.
There's more.
Okay.
And this one falls on this side too, right? You may have very strong personal beliefs or feelings on the other side of this issue, and you say, I don't want it on my property at all, and you have the right to do that. So, my recommendation. This is the language that I'm recommending across the board. We can circulate. I think. Were you collecting emails?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we have everybody's contact
Okay.
information. I believe, right, Jeanette?
This is also the language that's in the apartment owner's lease. So, the use, possession, and cultivation of marijuana in any form on these premises is strictly prohibited. A violation of this section is considered a breach of the lease agreement, and your tenancy may be terminated as a result. Why do I put may be? Because I'm a lawyer and I like to hedge my bets, and I like to give the landlord as many options available to them as possible. There might be circumstances where you find out somebody's violating this clause, but for whatever reason you decide it doesn't make sense to deal with it in a lease termination. The may be terminated gives you that flexibility to make a decision about what you're going to do. And it puts them on notice that they're not supposed to be doing it. Is this kind of language going to keep a majority of tenants from engaging in this behavior? I think so. Right?
No.
Same, well,
Not college students.
well, they shouldn't have it anyway because they're not even 21.
Even worse.
I think it'll
Right?
just be a problem if it's a problem, and I don't think this will stop. I don't
right.
think it'll stop vending.
No, I mean, I
In
think
general, I don't mean the
hey
5
guys,
years.
people are smoking pot in your units right now. I mean, even before the law went into effect.
Right. But
They
I will
are.
absolutely add
I
it
mean,
to my lease.
Add it to the lease. It's not going to hurt. It's going to give you another management tool in terms of dealing with tenants who are breaking this lease clause. Is it the end all to be all? Is it going to solve all of your problems when it comes to marijuana or smoking or tenants behaving badly? No. They break the lease all the time. The question is it bad enough, or is there a way to get them back on the straight and narrow that doesn't involve an eviction, right? Because your enforcement tool for dealing with any of these issues is an eviction. Long notice period, long court process, sometimes a not very fun court process. but you don't even have the ability to enforce it if it's not in your lease. So we're starting to see some of these kinds of signs crop up on the internet that you can order to put up. I don't know. You could go right next to your no parking sign.
Just a quick question. Now, if someone's in the lease and you have that provision in there, but then all of a sudden it's medical,
No.
it's prescribed, are they in breach of your contract then? So it still doesn't matter, so?
Still federal violation. Yeah.
What about the AD?
We'll get there, but yeah, it doesn't. It's still a federal violation.
What about their best friend who comes over, who's not on the lease?
So tenants are responsible for their guests and their guest behavior.
Okay. So did you put that in your lease, like, tenant is responsible for behavior?
You can. That's actually written in the statute. Not this marijuana statute, but just generally tenants are responsible for their guests' behavior.
Okay.
It's never their fault. Well, I didn't know he was gonna, punch a hole in the wall or break that window or name it, right? You guys have seen it all, right? I hear about some of it, but you folks have really deal with a little bit of everything. As we say in my office, you cannot make this stuff up. Well, it's not actually what we say, but you get the gist. So my caveat, right? So we're going back to the subsidized unit. So you have Section 8. If you have non-Section 8, you can use this language too. So I've changed the maybe to will be. Because the federal government and HUD has a zero tolerance for any drug-related activities in their units and properties. So landlords don't really have much of an option if they become aware of a violation. You don't have the flexibility with a subsidized unit like you would for a non-subsidized unit to be able to make a decision. If it's happening, they gotta go. Sort of no ifs, ands, or buts. So, just that one little tweak, the rest of it stays the same. Medical marijuana. We hear this a lot, but I got a medical marijuana card. Great. I don't care. Still prohibited. No exception. If you can't do it, they still can't do it. There's no requirement to provide what's called a reasonable accommodation for medical marijuana. And this is why. Because federal law does not require any medicinal use of marijuana. Does not recognize it. So they can wave their medical marijuana card at you all day long and the answer can still be no. Now, if they're ingesting their marijuana in a non-smoking form, you may not even know that it's happening, right? This is one of these probably really hard to enforce situations because most people who are truly on using the medical marijuana, not just as like a yay before it's legal I get to have it, who are using it to treat a serious medical condition, they're using it in conjunction with a doctor. They're not, some of them, there's always exceptions to this, right? But most of them are pretty private about it and not really flashing and making a big deal about it. So you may not even know. Now, could you choose in non-Section 8 subsidized units to make an exception for medical marijuana? Absolutely. Absolutely. But you don't have to. And the answer can be no to the tenant.
Would you modify your lease if you have a statement for marijuana use in your lease if you were to allow medical use for the tenant themselves?
Possibly. I think you still want to have maybe use the maybe language in that situation. Because if your tenant then is creating a problem, even with their medical marijuana use, you want to have some tool to be able to move them along. So I think it would take some careful wordsmithing to make that exception for medical marijuana if you wanted to explicitly put it in your lease.
So if you didn't exclude it and you had that in your lease, but you ignored you knowingly ignored they're using medical marijuana, and then it becomes a problem. So I guess that's why you would keep it in the lease.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most leases have what are called like a waiver clause. So it says if we're ignoring something and then decide to enforce it, we haven't waived our ability to do that. And that's why that's in there. So you can kind of keep an eye on something. I mean, that might be a situation where you could go to that person and say, listen, we get a couple of options here. You can either knock off whatever this behavior is that's causing this problem, or we're going to have to ask you to leave. And sometimes that works. Sometimes, you know, the door gets shut in your face, or they tell you, what are you going to do, evict me? Yes, actually we will. We will. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the legislature does again this year. And I think there's definitely some hope in certain segments of the community that we're going to see sort of the more commercial grow and sale operations be opened up in the state of Vermont. I don't know. We'll see. It's kind of this is the new Wild West for us with landlord-tenant, but I think you have the tools to be able to manage it within your properties. So the legalization of it hasn't created a situation where you can't say no. And I haven't figured out which actual senator or representative was responsible for making sure that language was in there. But they also, they took some time to put in some sections about prohibitions at work, right? So you can't, smoke a joint, go to work, and then be shocked if you get fired. So there's still, you have to be reasonable, right? It's probably going to start to look a lot like alcohol at some point, where when you do it in your own time, as long as you're not disturbing the neighbors. Sitting around this room, you all know you would have the right in your lease to prohibit alcohol consumption on your properties, right?
No, didn't know that.
Sure. Why wouldn't you be able to?
That was a question I was thinking. Why isn't like alcohol or?
I mean,
you can?
Yeah. There's nothing that prohibits you from telling your tenants they're not allowed to possess or consume alcohol on your property. I mean, you have an enforceability problem, perhaps, and nobody wants to live in your property. They can't live here. We have a vacant after property. You might have a vacant property, but there's nothing legally that prohibits you from putting that in your lease and saying you can't engage in this behavior on my property. But I think I just saw a whole room full of shocked faces, right? Because we've gotten to the point with alcohol where we don't even think about it, right? It's fine, it's great. I am suspecting that, 50 years, if I'm still doing this, and God help me if I am, but the next me who's doing this presentation is going to be like, whatever the new thing is, like, hey guys, you could prohibit pot use in your properties, and a room full of landlords are going to be like, what? Really? Because I think that's probably where things are headed, but maybe, I don't know.
So another marijuana-related product is CBD oil, which, if I'm not mistaken, is still federally illegal?
It's all still federally illegal.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So that is something that people can buy here at any grocery store, pretty much,
Right.
or food
But
store, yeah.
that's made with hemp, it doesn't have any THC in it.
Right, but that still has like a smell to it. It's still, I've smelt it. It smells like marijuana.
But you didn't inhale.
Do people use is that like? Are they using it as like aromatherapy, or are they using it as like
see, that's
de-stressor?
It was like
glass of wine.
the first
Not allowed.
week, and I was still putting up blinds in my tenant's apartment, and I saw they had whatever, like a e-cigarette thing, and it had CBD written on it, and I saw that, and I was like, wait, is that allowed, or is, like, I had no marijuana products written in my lease, but I didn't think about CBD.
What does
because that's,
your
like, legal
lease
in
say about smoking?
no smoking.
No smoking. We've started, I mean, that should cover you, right? But we've actually expanded our no smoking clause to say no smoking, including electronic cigarettes, vaping systems. Like, we're starting to name them all out because if you don't, they all have sort of that off-gassing, different issues, some more than others. But if you had a no smoking clause that had that other expanded stuff in it, they wouldn't be able to do that inside.
Yeah.
But if they want to stand out on the street and do it, well, fine, you know, in compliance with the unit or with the lease. One of the issues that came up this last legislative session that did not go anywhere related to marijuana was there was a push with some municipalities. So we see this a lot. The police officers come in and they are so offended that this has even gone into effect. Like, they're just, it's kind of funny. It is. It's just a personal work of mine that I think it's funny. Anyway, there was a push to give municipalities tools to be able to fine people who were violating ordinances, right? Because the municipalities have the ability to also regulate where people can smoke and use and not in public spaces. And, you know, municipalities were concerned, well, what if somebody's in their backyard and they're, you know, having a bong party and the neighbors are upset because they've got small children and the wind's blowing downwind and the marijuana smoke's coming over. And so that they were asking for some tools to be able to find people, and I was like, well, I know what you guys are going to do with this. You're not going to find the tenant who's actually the one using the product. You're going to go to the landlord and you're going to be like, your tenant's smoking pot in the backyard. We're going to find you, landlord, and you deal with the problem. And we were like, no, that's not okay. So that didn't go anywhere, but that we may see that rear its head again with local folks who want to be able to deal with this problem. Because right now, if you're a homeowner, you can do what you want in your backyard as long as you're not over the limits. And I don't think the municipalities have any tools for dealing with neighbor complaints.
A lot of what you talk about is leases that sound more like long-term. I have an Airbnb.
Yeah.
Have you been dealing a lot with, because that's something all of a sudden I'm like, I should be putting into my short-term lease.
Yeah.
That none of this use, and I know a lot of people are probably coming to Vermont because this is like, you know, woohoo.
Woo! Vacation!
Weekend at Lake Iroquois.
I don't know where they think they're gonna get it. You can't buy it.
Well, I have
You're gonna
t-shirts.
leave packets for them in their
I have
welcome.
$50
So
t-shirts.
it's church tree, buy a t-shirt.
So everybody rents Sarah's Airbnb. She's next to the Vermont bacon and maple syrup is a side of welcome brownies. I think the Airbnb part was going to be more of an issue if Vermont legalizes the sale. I mean, it doesn't mean they can't bring it with them, right?
Right.
If people want marijuana now, you can find it.
Well, you have to get it on a plane, or you have to get it on
You know, what's interesting is I was flying out of Portland, Oregon a year or two ago, and they are one of the states, or maybe it was Seattle, it was one of the states that's completely legalized. Like, it's a free-for-all. It wasn't Colorado. It was either Oregon or Washington State. And there were all these signs up in the airport. Notice, if you were flying out of this state, please make sure you have no marijuana in your pockets. And I was like, wait, where am I? So apparently, if you were flying in-state, you could fly with it on the airplane, and it's not a big deal. And TSA, who's a federal agency, wasn't doing it. I don't know. It was this weird. Yeah, it was really weird. Totally weird. So there's ways to get it. They'll bring it with them, but it might not be bad to put something in your rules that you have, like house rules for your Airbnb, or on your advertisement. You know, we do not allow pot smoking, marijuana smoking. You want to be a little classier. Yeah.
Well, if you have no smoking in your lease,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't have to specifically say marijuana smoking, right? That just covers smoking. Right?
Do you rent to tenants?
Yes.
Okay. No, you don't have to, but I would recommend it.
Okay.
Because it's like they want to be my 7-year-old, right? You guys have kids? Do you know what, like, elementary school kids are like? Well, you didn't say.
Right.
I'm like, oh, for Pete's sake. Well, it was implied. It's right there under the smoking. Well, you didn't say no marijuana smoking. So we figured it was okay, even though it says no smoking. I would just add it in.
So add tobacco,
It's
marijuana.
gonna cut down on the headaches. Gonna cut down on the headaches, I think, long term.
So I guess my question is, at this point, like, we have a 54-unit building, so,
Mm-hmm.
and all the new tenants coming in is in the new lease, which is great, but for the current tenants, should we, A, send the lease addendum and have them sign it ASAP, or B, should we wait for lease renewals to come up and then start adding it into the lease renewal?
I would send it out now
Okay.
as an addendum to your existing tenants and be like, this is where we're going. I mean, if you're already in a no smoking building and have,
Yeah.
it shouldn't be a big surprise
Yeah.
to them that this is the way this property is going to go. But there's this disconnect, right? Oh, I didn't think it was going to apply for this.
It's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing. I don't know.
When you're putting that language in there, would it be okay to use no marijuana use of any kind?
Mhm.
Or would that kind of cover all ingesting, smoking, or vaping, whatever?
I think, yeah. I mean, that's another way to put it. I'm just scrolling back here. Use, possession, cultivation of marijuana in any form.
Okay,
Yeah,
in any form, okay.
yeah. So you are covered with that
Excellent.
language. It's going to be interesting to see what the legislature does this next year.
Do you actually think that they will be pushing more towards the commercialization of it?
I think it depends on how the election comes out in November. I think it's within the realm of possibilities.
You need to say distribution as well, because what if someone says, well, I didn't possess it, I was the transient person.
Well, distribution's still illegal, right? So Act 86 only is for amounts for personal use. So you start getting, if you're in like the distribution level, which is going to far exceed the 1 ounce for personal use that you're allowed to have on your
Well, I
possession.
mean, distribution, like if someone gave you, I'm gonna give you half an ounce because I'm such a good friend.
Yep.
Is that considered distribution?
No.
What is that considered?
Gift.
So no, use possession gifting?
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
If it's transient possession, it's still possession.
It's still right. Now, if your distribution, if your tenant's the one distributing, they're gonna have more than 1 ounce, right? Where you potentially run into problems is under that cultivation exemption, right? If it's harvested, stored
Yeah.
under the cultivation, they're gonna be able to possess more
Yeah.
than the 1 ounce, which is why cultivation shouldn't. I don't think you should be allowing cultivation on your properties, period.
Because how much can they possess when they harvest it? They basically-
Unlimited, there's no limits
There's
on
no
it.
limit to what they can store?
As long as they can show they've grown it and harvested it and are storing it in compliance with the statute, there's no limits.
So they could store and harvest 10 pounds of pot and have it.
As long as
stored
they've
on-
done it with their 2 mature plants at a time.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's scary.
yeah,
That's illegal.
yeah. So the cultivation, I'd say that's an absolute no-no across the board. I don't know, I mean, if you've got like a old cabin in the middle of nowhere with no neighbors around that you're renting out and somebody wants to grow some in the backyard. I don't know. Like, there's always exceptions, or somebody can always come up with a way that it might work. But I think that's headed down the road of lots of trouble, not only for the building, but just in general. So if somebody was cultivating and then gifting to folks, that would be hard. But if you're not allowing cultivation, then you're out of that conversation anyway.
Yeah, okay.
So I think the not allowing cultivation is going to keep you out of that scenario. Because if you're still in the business of distributing large amounts of marijuana, you could still get arrested and go to jail, right? So this has only taken penalties away for what they've deemed personal use amounts. So Sarah wanted me to talk a little bit about our upcoming seminars. We have 3 more seminars coming up. They're the first Wednesday of every month for October, November, and December. So seminar number 2, the next one, is everything you need to know about termination notices. And it's not as straightforward as you might think. There's attorneys that get tripped up with the termination notice statute and requirements. So that should be an interesting one. Seminar number 3 is talking more in depth about leases and what are recommended clauses to have in leases and the structure and information you should have in a lease. The 4th seminar I've labeled Stump the Presenter. So that's the one I want you to come in with your questions. What do you want to know that we haven't answered so far? Let's have a conversation. Collectively, landlords as a group, you can learn from each other. I always say I always learn something when I go to these seminars when I'm presenting, because inevitably somebody in the audience has an idea or a method or an issue that I haven't run across or I haven't thought about or other landlords in the room haven't thought about. And so it's a great way for all of us to learn and get your questions answered. So, come into all of them, keep a list, and we'll do that one in December for anything that we haven't covered for the prior 3. So I'd say thank you for coming. I'm still here for questions if folks have more questions.
Talk a little bit about the Landlords Association and the membership and all the benefits of that, because that's pretty phenomenal.
Okay, cool. I will do that. So the Vermont Apartment Owners Association, which is the name on the brochure, but we've been kind of transitioning to Vermont Landlords Association because I think it's a little more apropos of who we represent and what we do. We're a trade organization for landlords. We are there to support landlords. There's no other entities in the state that are doing this. The state government doesn't do it. We are the place you can go for answers to questions, leases, rental applications, inspection checklists, termination notices. The only thing we don't get involved with is the court process. So we're membership based, $250 a year. I say newsletters when I can get them out because I'm sort of a one-woman show. So I'm trying. I have one that's almost ready to go out the door. My hope was to get it done last week, so clearly I'm doing well at this point because it's Wednesday of the following week. And a big part of what I do and what my job is legislative work down in Montpelier. So the association has a lobbyist that monitors, but I'm the one that's down there testifying on a lot of these issues, providing sort of expert testimony for legislators on landlords' concerns, landlords' issues, and just making sure that they're not eroding your rights even more. And I think Sarah alluded to sitting on various legislative committees. The other piece of legislation that came out this last year was the creation of the Rental Housing Advisory Board, which I was lucky enough to get appointed, we'll use lucky in air quotes, lucky enough to get appointed to for a 3-year term. So basically I'm sitting on a board with a bunch of other folks and we're looking at housing issues around the state. I can tell you right now what they're looking at is a statewide rental registry and statewide inspection program. So there will be some opportunities for public comment. We're going to be opening it up and having people comment. So get engaged. The association's one of the ways you can do that because we're providing updates on what's happening, when those hearings are going to be held, and what they're looking for feedback on. So it's a way to get involved. And we're also part therapy organization, right? We understand.
Misery loves company, is that?
Yes. We are a landlord safe space. You can come complain to us about your tenants and we get it. And we'll help you find some solutions, hopefully, along the way for dealing with them. So,
It just amazes me how the tenants seem to have all the rights and the landlords have nothing really to stand on, especially when you're trying to evict and it takes 6 months to get them out. And the landlord's paying the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, the repairs, everything, and they're just sitting there not paying rent.
Here's my 2 cents on that.
Okay.
We are going to cover that a little bit more in seminar 2. But does the eviction process take some time? Yes. What I found is the landlords who struggle with it the most have waited too long to start the process, or they haven't sought the proper advice when starting the process, and so they get partway through and find out they've done something wrong and they have to start again. That's not to say that there aren't situations that do take a significant amount of time, but most of the time, if the landlord's on top of it, the tenant owes rent, they're not waiting 4 months to send a termination notice, they're getting on it the first month or the beginning of the second month when that rent situation hasn't gotten cleared up, their processes go a lot smoother and they're not as angry about the situation. The ones who wait, I had a landlord come in who hadn't had rent for a year, and I'm like, what are you doing? Why? So it's being proactive, but also being proactive with the right tools and making sure your paperwork and your documents and what you're doing are correct. But yes, it does take a long time.
Is it 3 months, 6 months? What is
Depends on what county you're in. Chittenden, 3 to 4 months from the time you start the court action. Franklin, much longer.
Are you recording the session, Sarah?
Angela is recording these.
I think I'm gonna have to miss my session. There's one I really want to attend.
The plan is to
access to the
post them on the
I'm gonna
Landlords
try to
Association.
YouTube channel. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So you have to be part
That
of
was
the
great.
association to do that.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Ann.